Hey guys, and welcome back. This is Say Chat Season 2, Episode 3. We are back with our wonderful panel for this season. They are very knowledgeable people who are giving all of the good tips and information for new players about World vs. World. Today we're going to be going over World vs. World builds and what the most important things that you should keep in mind as a new player, what they are, what matters, what things that you should make sure you know in your build, incorporate in your build, because I know some people like theory crafting, and all of that good stuff. But before that, panel, would you like to say hello to everyone so they know your voices?
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Chef.
I'm Sahana.
Hey, this is
Hi.
Quietly.
Yeah. Oh no.
Oh,
hello. Some of these guys are imposters, but I'll let you figure out who. I am going to throw it directly over to Chef, the real chef, not the fake chef, and ask them, generally, what do you think is the most important things in a build for World vs. World in regards to, a new player approaching the situation?
Yeah, so it's gonna depend on what you do. The answer that I give is going to be an answer that's informed by the way that I play, which is in organized groups that are, 20 to 25 most of the time. There's going to be different answers if you're a roamer. There's going to be different answers if you do PPT. So I'll try to just give it as like a general overview of what matters in World vs. World. We mentioned in a previous episode that when you're doing PvE, alacrity and quickness are kind of king in terms of what your group composition looks like. In World vs. World, everything revolves around stability. And so if you think about an average World vs. World party, a group of 5 people, there's going to be one class, specifically a support firebrand, that is dedicated exclusively to providing stability. And that is a core function within the game mode, and has been a core function within the game mode for about as long as it's existed. And then beyond that, there are 6 other roles. This is my personal theory. This is not gospel, so feel free to pick it apart. But I think there are 6 other roles that matter in World vs. World, and 6 other things that a build that's good in World vs. World should be able to do. And those things are damage, particularly spike damage over sustained damage, condition removal, so that's condition clears and also condition conversions, boon removal in the form of strips and corrupts, and then healing, hard and soft crowd control, and other useful stuff, which is things like stealth, portals, resurrection utilities. So my working theory about what's important in a World vs. World build is that a good build is usually able to do multiple of these things at the same time. Like, have other people, pick that apart and see if there's any issues with that way of thinking.
I mean, I think that's a pretty accurate description. Necromancer kind of has a pretty strong hold on boon corruption, unfortunately. I think that's Mesmer kind of can a little bit too.
Yeah, Chrono is pretty common right now.
Spellbreaker also goes pretty hard on corrupts. Mm-hmm. Well, not corrupts. Spellbreaker goes pretty hard on strips. I think corrupts are kind of like Necro's unique thing. But I think there's a couple other viable classes for strips for sure.
Maybe the 4th round of Elite Specs will see something like that out of some classes. I don't know. That'd be kind of cool.
That would be kind of cool. I wonder what other classes they would put it into. That's my big thing. Because, it seems like Necro, the theme of Necro just works really well with corrupts, right?
Right.
So what other theme, what other classes, a theme that would generally work well with corrupts? I'm not sure if...
Well, I think you can kind of change the theme with an Elite Spec, though, because, Harbinger got Elixir, and, you wouldn't think Elixir is really Necro.
True.
Yeah, I wouldn't drink any juice that a Necromancer gave me, man.
I don't know, maybe they do something really cool, somehow, a corrupt Ellie, or not, a corrupt Ellie would be cool, or, a corrupt NG, or,
Untamed.
Or Revenant. Revenant would be a good one, too. Revenant with
Make Thief be Zerg viable, maybe.
Yeah.
Ranger's getting there. Druid's getting there a little bit.
Is Druid good? I haven't tried Druid and Zergs in like
Druid's
got
content
yet.
Kinda sick now.
Druid is amazing on
it's pretty cool.
Cleanses. It can out cleanse like scrappers.
A little bit of super speed, a little bit of super
speed.
Yeah, and a ton. It's crazy good,
dude. That's so good for Rangers.
And some stab.
That's like huge for Ranger mains who have been like, we have nothing to get into group content. Please help us. That's huge. That's actually really cool to hear.
Here you go on a silver platter.
Okay, so steering away from like specific classes, what else do we think goes into, other than Chef's like 6 things that he mentioned? What goes into a good build, or what do you think people should know about their build specifically, or if they're like theory crafting, what do you think they should like put into a build?
I think if you're new, one of the best things you can do is, I mean, it sounds like no shit, right? But read your traits.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, like knowing and understand. Don't just like read them. Like, I try to understand what they're actually going to do for you is insanely high value.
True.
Also, like if you enjoy theory crafting, I totally encourage that. But if you're going to theory craft, it helps to start with a good working knowledge of why current builds are already good. I see a lot of people get excited about theory crafting who are like, oh, I'm not going to read about Support Firebrand because everyone's playing it already. It's not that people are playing Support Firebrand because they haven't theory crafted other options. It's people play Support Firebrand because it's ridiculously strong. And if you're going to try and figure out what's good in World versus World and what kind of weird off-meta builds are viable, it's worth understanding what makes existing builds so strong. And for Firebrand specifically, and for stability specifically, people who read patch notes extremely closely will probably have seen that there was a proposed mantra change before the October 4th patch that got rolled back, where the elite mantra, the stun break and stability providing skill, was going to be dropped from 3 charges to 2.
People threw
people threw a fit correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Because there aren't a lot of other good stability options in World versus World. And the reason stability is so important in particular is because if you don't have stability, you don't really get to play the game. Not having stability makes World versus World actively unfun, because it means that your character sits around stunned, dazed, feared, etc., while the other group gets to continue pressing buttons. And that's extremely powerful.
True. You can tell the difference in a squad. I said this last season, actually, because we had this exact same conversation. You can tell the difference between if your party has a firebrand when you're in group content, or if they don't have a firebrand. Because if you don't have a firebrand in your squad, and you don't have your own self-sustaining stability, which is something that I would recommend people know about, know which traits you need, or know which skills you need to switch out to have your own stability. So when you have a firebrand in your squad, you can switch that out, and when you don't, you have your own stab. Because if you don't have your own stab, you are knocked around, you're rooted in place, and you just die without being able to click any of your skills, and that's just really unfun, right?
Yeah.
It's
and
huge.
It's not like you have a suspicion, you're like, oh, I feel like I might not have a firebrand. You know immediately. You know from the first couple seconds of the first fight, you're like, I have no stab.
Yeah. It's like night and day difference. Yeah. Another thing, since we're on the topic of like being rooted in spot or knocked around and stuff like that, another thing that I personally would suggest that people know is know which of your skills is a stun break. Obviously, in most cases, hopefully you won't need to use it, because if you have a firebrand in your squad, or if you have your own source of stability, then you won't get rooted in place. But sometimes, your firebrand dies a little bit early, or sometimes, they're a little bit off stack, so you may not get the stab, or you've used your stability and you get rooted and stuff like that. Knowing which one is your stun break is going to save you in situations where you're rooted, you're off squad or off tag, and you just need that quick stun break to get back onto tag so that you can survive and stay in the fight, so that you aren't downed and then you rally all of those enemy players. That's another big one, in my opinion, but yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
What other kind of like little things do you think people should know about their builds or like include in their builds? Other than like, we talked about reading your stats or reading your skills overall just to know what they do, but what do you guys think? Do you think having a good heal skill would be good, or what are your thoughts? Sahana and Zee, you guys haven't really chimed in yet. Do you guys have any opinions?
I mean, yeah, kind of having, I guess, the appropriate heal skill for whatever type of content you're doing in World v World. I would assume maybe you'd have a different heal skill if you're roaming versus, if you're doing group content, and or also being aware of what abilities, either through sigils or utility, that will offer condi clears on yourself, because that's also really important to manage while you're playing the game.
Oh yeah, condi clear is a big one. What about runes and sigils? How do you guys feel about those? Do you think they're essential, or?
I'm generally a fan of using runes and sigils.
Yeah. I am. There's cleansing sigils. When you swap, you can cleanse a condi from it. All that fun stuff. You get ones that would give you more energy, so that you can have more dodges. It's a whole load of nice stuff. They're important. You can't just throw on stuff and expect some magic to happen. You kind of have to know why you choose what you want to choose.
At least for group play, it's a really interesting balance between personal accountability and then also like knowing your role in a squad. So like, let's say that you're playing DPS Dragon Hunter, and we just spent all this time talking about how stability is so important. If you knew absolutely nothing else about World versus World, you might think that Stand Your Ground is really good to use on DPS Dragon Hunter, and that is absolutely not the case. That's your Firebrand's job. So everything inside a party kind of has its own role, and a good build is a build that performs the specific role to the best of its ability. The role of support Firebrand is to give stab as well as possible. The role of DPS Dragon Hunter is to do damage as well as possible. And running Stand Your Ground on DPS Dragon Hunter, despite stab being so important, isn't the role of the Dragon Hunter, it's the role of the Firebrand. So you might think that, because it's a competitive game mode, everyone should kind of be self-sufficient, and that's true to an extent, but it's also a game mode about overall squad construction and having your squad perform as best as possible, rather than just you doing as much as possible. And I think that adds a lot of nuance into the different builds that you use.
Yeah, I think ultimately it's, especially if you're looking to theory craft or anything like that, it's a really fine line between what is going to allow you to do the job that you have picked for yourself, whether that's support or DPS or anything like that, versus the utility that you can get to make your life a little bit easier. Because, self-sustain and self-reliability is important to an extent, but if that comes at a cost of, you doing damage, which is the job that you signed up for, then is that skill really worth it? Is that trait really worth bringing when you could bring something else? But it is a fine line. There's a lot of balancing that comes into it, and I think there is a little bit of like personal preference also, or personal playstyle rather, that kind of goes into it as well. But ultimately, you want to be able to do the job that you picked well, while also being able to help the squad as much as possible on like a holistic level.
This is kind of an interesting topic within the topic, niche within the topic. I guess it's like an interesting conversation because you kind of see this difference in comp squads versus like pug squads, right? Because I feel like in pug squads, people try to run a little bit more sustainable, like for themselves. So you can tell there's like a huge difference in what pug squads are capable of versus what like comp squads are capable of. At least that's my opinion. Obviously there's other factors in pug squads, like usually in pugs they don't stack as tight and they aren't, as organized, and they're not everyone's in comms most of the time. So it's like there's there's major differences, but also I think when I'm in a pug squad, at least I'll run my own stab, so I'll have to switch out one of my other skills. If I'm running like Necro, I'll switch something out so that I have Trails of Anguish or whatever it's called, so that I have a stab for myself, just in case, because I don't know the firebrand. I don't know that I'm gonna get a firebrand. I don't know all of these different factors, so as long as I stay up longer and have my own source of stab, then it's going to be okay. Versus when I'm in a comped group, I know I'm going to get a firebrand. I'm going to be able to rely on that firebrand because I know this group. I know this group has good firebrands. They know what they're doing and stuff like that. So I don't know. I think that's kind of an interesting conversation that went on. Because you can see the difference if you comparatively go from like a pug group to a competitive or like to a comped group. I don't know. It's interesting. It's definitely an interesting conversation. What else do we think? What about like gear and stuff like that? I know a lot of the time when people are getting into World versus World, people will be like, run Marauder if you're on a power build, right? This is just an example. Like, make sure you're running Marauder. And then as you get into being a vet more, people will switch out the Marauder for Berserker gear or something like that because they know their builds more and feel more comfortable and don't need as much sustain. So, like, in regards to gear and stuff like that, do you think it's like super important to be picking the right gear like Marauder versus Berserker, or what are your guys' opinions on that whole thing?
When I've had to give advice for gearing, so I'm the Necro class lead for KNT, and I haven't had to do this for some time because everyone in KNT is old now. But when I used to be young, and when other people used to be young, the goal would be to move towards Berserker, but in reality, you would run as much tank as you needed. And so I definitely think it is kind of a progression of like, run as much damage as you can afford to while still being able to live, which is complicated when you don't have a legendary armory and it might be difficult to swap between Marauder and Berserker. So I think a lot of the advice is like, run Marauder because it's fairly tanky. I guess that's really the only option because any support build is just going to run like Minstrel or Selly if you're a Spellbreaker. It's kind of like erring on the side of caution, right? Where it's like, you'll probably have enough tank to live on this, and if you don't, that's a positioning issue that should probably get worked on.
Yeah. This is a pretty... Sorry?
I was going to say, I think it's the same thing with Sigil of Energy as well, where eventually you will probably be good enough at dodging that you don't need to run double Sigil of Energy, but it's safe. It's a safe fallback in case something goes wrong, and it might keep you alive in a situation where you would have died otherwise.
Regal, what were you going to say?
So, Chef, you mentioned the legendary armory and stat swapping, so I was just going to have a small aside here, something I wish people would have told me when I started. If your plan in the game long term is to have legendary everything, you should definitely start with your 6 trinkets. Nobody told me that. I really wish they would have. You should honestly go trinkets, armor, and then weapons last. I pretty much did the opposite of that, and it was very painful collecting winter berries for days on end to have all the trinkets I want. So if your plan is to go full legendary, I would highly recommend trinkets.
Yeah. And this is like an aside completely out of World versus World. But if you're a new player and you're wanting to do legendaries, what I personally did is that I got all of my exotic and ascended gear through other means than crafting, and I saved all of my materials until I was able to craft my legendary gear. I went gear first and then trinkets, and I'm kind of regretting it because I wish I had gone trinkets first. But yeah, I don't know. That's what I did. I guess it's not the route for everyone.
You get 2 free full sets of Ascended armor in the first 4 raid wings.
Yes, that's what I did. I got Ascended through that, and then after that, I just stuck with like whatever could use those Ascended and got my legendary gear.
She's the best Reaper on North America, by the way. She's too humble to say it. But...
No, that's not true. Chef is the best Reaper.
True. That's pretty true. You also get a ton... I guess, yeah. So I built legendary armor first, because I was like, I just want to skip the hassle. You get an enormous amount of exotic quality armor thrown at you in World vs. World.
True.
So every week that you pip, I think it's through gold, you get a Warlord's armor box, which is one piece of stat selectable exotic armor for any slot. And you just get one once a week. So every 6 weeks you can gear a new character and a new set of armor.
Mm-hmm.
And 6 weeks might sound like a lot, but maybe you play World vs. World for a couple months and all of a sudden you've got 12 Warlords armor boxes and you're like, wow, I can gear 2 entirely new characters.
Jeff, do you know if the Warlord's
totally
armor has DLC specs in it?
I can check right now because I think I have a box on me.
I have a bunch in my bank.
I've
too.
checked, and I don't think it does have the new
Is
stuff
anyone
in it.
actually using those new specs though? Like, I don't think
No.
anyone
In World v. World, no.
I don't think so.
I have to worry about that. I know that Ritualist is one that people are like kind of using in PvE, but like you can still get Marauder, you can still get Berserker, you can still get Celestial, which is huge because Celestial's a time gate otherwise, and you could get Minstrel, which is huge because Minstrel is like
Minstrel's so hard to get.
It's
so hard to get.
expensive as heck. First of all,
When people ask me how to get Ritualist, actually is very good in PvE. When people ask me how they get that for like trinkets, I unironically tell them to make legendary trinkets because it is so. I mean, it just doesn't exist.
Can you not get it through the berry farm? Those are all stats selectable, aren't they?
Those are EOD specs. Ritualist is.
Oh, so you can't get it. I thought
No,
the berry
they do
farm
not
grind was
update.
everything.
Are the Mistatune items in World vs. World able to select Rituals?
Yeah, those are all stats. They should be able to.
Okay. World vs. World
I
wins again.
I would like to see that because I have had people tell me they can't select those on specifically the EOD specs. They can't choose them on any old stats. I know you can't with the raid armor.
That's kind of funky in my opinion. I don't know why ANET would do that because when you think stat selectable, you think like all stats.
all of it.
Especially with things that are universal, like World vs. World PvP, all of that stuff. I can understand the berry farm ones not being it because it's such old content, but when you're getting an ascended stat selectable ring or a trinket from World vs. World, you should be able to get all of the stats, right? Because World vs. World is universal. It's not based on one X-spec. You know what I mean? So I'm actually, if that's true, I'm actually kind of disappointed in ANET that they did that. Because that doesn't make sense in my opinion. But
might have been an oversight. Might also still be changed.
yeah.
I think that they did that recently, or somewhat recently. They added more stats to something stats selectable. I can't exactly remember which on the top of my head.
Well, hopefully it's an oversight. Because it doesn't make sense in my opinion. But
I've got a question about learning a World vs. World build that I'm interested in putting forth.
yes. Bring on the question.
I do rotation videos and build videos for World vs. World at
Shameless plug.
youtube.com/Sheffplaysgames as soon as they roll out the hashtag system to me. And I got into a really interesting discussion on Reddit with someone who I'm not going to out because I didn't ask them if I could use this conversation. But they basically said that I shouldn't call my World vs. World rotation videos because you don't have rotations in World vs. World. You use different skills based on the context of what's going on in the fight. And I still haven't quite figured out how I feel about that. Because there are absolutely some classes that have rotations, but it's also, especially for supports, very context dependent on when you would want to use those rotations and when you'd even want to use individual skills. So I'm curious, do you guys think, in terms of learning a World vs. World build, because rotations are everything in PvE, right? You have a set of buttons and you press them in that order, and that's what you do the whole time. What do you guys think about rotations in World vs. World? Do you think there are rotations? Do you think everything is just press this skill in reaction to this thing happening? Do you think there's like small micro rotations that are 2 or 3 skills that you want to do in combo with one another? What's your thoughts on actually doing like World vs. World quote unquote rotations?
I think it's kind of priority.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there might be small, like, micro rotations.
Yeah, I was gonna say. Go ahead.
But, like, I mean, especially for Firebrand support, you kind of, like, a lot of the things you do is preemptive, you know? You kind of need to give people stab before things actually try to knock them down or immobilize them, things like that.
Well, it's like Scourge. You're going to drop your wells before you do anything else, usually. You're going to want your wells out there first.
But for Scourge specifically, I played Scourge for about a year before someone else told me that there was actually, like, an order that you were supposed to use your weapon skills in. And it fundamentally changed the way that I played Scourge. And, like, all of a sudden I had a ton of boon strips. Or, I guess, as a better example, since all of us are Firebrand mains here, except for Quietly, my understanding of the Tome 3, of your usage of Tome 3, is that you use 4 and 5 together. You use 1, 2, or 3, preferably 2 or 3, because 1 isn't very good. And then you use 4 and 5 again and drop Tome. That, to me, is a rotation. Like, I would describe that as a Tome rotation. And your Tome rotation is 4 or 5, choose 1, 4 or 5, drop Tome.
Yeah. I think that, piggybacking off of that, I think what made the most sense to me, Regal, as you were walking through the 3 different styles, I guess, was that it's, especially as support Firebrand, it's definitely, like, mini rotations that you know that these skills combine together in a way that's, like, incredibly helpful for your group. But when to unleash that is all based on the context and the situation that you're in.
I mean, I like to call them, rotations or mini rotations, because that helps people remember them a little bit more easily, or can call back on them more easily when they see a certain situation, pop up, and then they can just, like, oh yes, this mini rotation, and then they just, muscle memory, click their buttons, or whatever.
I kind of am interested with the fact that they said that it's, like, different from PvE, I guess. Because, honestly, if you're playing, like, let's take raids, for instance. I don't play support in raids anymore, but I used to play Druid a lot. And, honestly, support is really reactionary in PvE, too. Sure, you have some, like, you push these buttons and these orders, but if you're not healing at specific points in the fight, and you're just following, like, a rotation, you're not gonna get the heals out in the correct time or the barrier out in the correct time for it to actually have an effect on the fight and keep your squad alive. You're gonna drop all of your heals when people don't need heals because you're just following 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and you're not doing anything. So it's like, how come a support in raids can have a rotation, as they said, and be reactionary like that, but then when you go into World versus World and it's reactionary also, just everything's reactionary instead, how come, like, what's the difference? I don't see the difference. It's, if you do a number of buttons in a set order, like more than 2 to 3 buttons in a set order, then that's a rotation, isn't it? I guess we'd need to know the definition of a rotation, right?
Yeah, and I'm not saying that this person on Reddit is right or wrong. I don't mean to cast this in, like, a negative or positive light. I think it was a really interesting question to raise in the first place. So, like, big kudos to them.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of it is that when you're doing PvE, things happen on a schedule. Like, a boss has timers when they use abilities, and there are no timers in World versus World. So your support is reactionary when you're fighting a boss in PvE, but you're reacting to a thing that you know is going to happen. And in World versus World, when you're playing support, you're reacting to a thing that you're pretty sure is about to happen. But, maybe that enemy group is faking a push, and you just blew your stand your ground for nothing because you thought they were going to commit in, and they didn't commit in. And maybe that's one of the things that makes calling it a rotation more complicated, is that your rotation doesn't start until you know that a group is going to do something, but you have to anticipate when that group is going to do something.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair enough, but, like, there's specific things that you're going to do on engage. I mean, sure, like, when the engage happens is going to be different, but there's still going to be, okay, we have now engaged, so I'm going to push these buttons. Which is the same as PvE, where, okay, we've started the boss fight, so I'm going to push these buttons. Or, this mechanic happens, so I'm going to push these buttons. Like, I don't think that there's pattern to PvE, and there's reaction to World versus World, but I don't think that they're as different as people would say that they are, and I still think that it's considered a rotation because based on this, I'm gonna do this type thing. I don't know. It is an interesting question. Question.
Also,
like
for full disclosure, I don't think that I'm even in the rotation camp. If you're, coming here from one of my rotation videos or you're familiar with them, I'm calling them rotation videos to get people in the door. I'm not calling them rotation videos because I think they're actually a rotation. I think it's just like the best keyword to capture the idea of what they're supposed to be. If it were up to me, I'd probably call them skill combos. Because they really are like these discrete sets of button presses that you want to use one after another, but when you actually use them is really context dependent.
Combos is good. I don't know, I think combos would get people in the door. But we should probably steer away from this conversation now because we're past 30 minutes in this episode. Getting away from rotations and all of that stuff, where do you guys find your builds for World vs. World, or where could people find their builds for World vs. World?
Hardstock.gg.
Shameless plug.
Shame.
Linked
Zero shame.
Linked below in the description at the very top.
That's big.
Meta battle's also pretty good, and if you're doing so, this is a contentious topic, and if Guild Gen or Meta Battle themselves are listening, know that I am repeating things that I've read elsewhere. This does not necessarily reflect the way that I believe these sites work, but I have heard that Meta Battle tends to be better for group builds, and Guild Gen tends to be better for roaming builds. I don't know if that's true, but I've seen it repeated a lot, which makes me feel like it's true.
Guild Gen is a roamer, so that would make sense. Like, she's reached out to me with last season of Say Chat, and she said that she'd really appreciate it if we did, like, a roaming season. So that's actually in the works. But she is a roamer, so it would make sense that her content is more roaming favored. You know?
Okay.
But, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Probably the better source for roaming builds then would be Guild Gen.
I agree.
And I like Meta Battle, and then, find a build that you want to try, and then I usually end up tweaking it to whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I've discovered anyways.
Oh, and if you're listening to this and you're in a guild, play what your guild tells you to play.
That too.
Yeah.
Like, until you're
honestly
much more
played the
comfortable
guild.
with the game. Because the guild is going to expect you to play a certain kind of way to fulfill a larger role in the squad. And it's going to be more important to do what your squad thinks you're doing, even if you think it's a slightly suboptimal build, than to play something that you think is better, but doesn't perform the role that it's supposed to perform in the overall squad comp.
True.
Guild builds are usually derived after like a lot of testing, a lot of
trial and error.
A lot of trial and error. They're not just whipped out there for no reason. So I think if you're just like if you're just starting World vs. World, Meta Battle is a great place, especially if you don't have a guild yet. But as you find yourself, you maybe really like it, and you find a guild that you really enjoy running with. Definitely play the build that the guild has created.
True. I don't think I know of any other build sites out there other than Hardstock.
I know of a really good builds YouTube channel. But it'll be in the description probably.
Probably.
Do you want to shamelessly plug again, Chef? Or
no, that's okay.
Okay. Who else? Valen has some World vs. World stuff up on his YouTube. I don't think Reddish does any builds, so he's more like guides, right? I don't know.
Yeah, Reddish is more guides.
I don't know of anyone else who does
shout
builds.
Shout out Taygeta. Yeah. Taygeta does some really great builds.
Taygeta? You said
Taygeta.
Remind me to link that in the description below.
Yeah.
Or
ask people questions. That's probably the best thing you can do.
Yeah, ask.
There's a lot of Discords. Cough, HS that have like World v World professions, and there's a channel for each class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ask questions. Heartstuck is like, I'm a little bit biased, but it's a really good resource, and there's a lot of knowledgeable people in there. So just joining that Discord in general for all of Guild Wars 2 would be really good, especially if you want to get into content. You could also, if you're in a PVX guild or even a PvE guild, I can guarantee that probably a few of your guildies play World vs. World, and they can recommend something for you. Obviously, there's gonna be like some bias in, what role they play, what type of content they like to do and stuff like that, but generally, just talking and trying things out is gonna be a really great way to find a build. Another thing is that I would recommend starting a World vs. World on a class that you're comfortable in. This is kind of hard at the moment because there's specific classes that don't work in some content that ANET is starting to fix. Like, previous to the patch before we recorded this, Ranger was not a very good Zerg class. There weren't any builds for it. It was a very selfish class. It didn't do anything for other classes and things like that. And that has changed now because ANET has been making changes, so now Druid is actually very, very good for group composition in World vs. World, from what I've been hearing from the panel. So, play something that you're comfortable in, but just realize that at the moment, at the time of recording this, not everything is going to work, so you're going to need to allow yourself some wiggle room, and you might need to change things around and stuff like that. And it might affect how you are able to consume the content. So, I don't know, does anybody have any other closing statements they want to make about, learning a World vs. World build, finding a World vs. World build, or anything like that?
Play both a support and a damage character, so that you can see both sides. I firmly believe that playing a support class makes you a better damage class.
True.
And playing a damage class makes you a better support class.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I've got my
Absolutely.
PH Firebrand.
True.
Also, I don't know if people, you don't need Ascended gear, the armor, at least, and the weapons, to successfully play World v World. You do not need the Ascended stuff. It's easier to farm Ascended trinkets because they're stat selectable, so that would be, the only Ascended stuff you could have, but, you can play the entire game in exotic gear and succeed and be happy.
Yeah, it's only 6% increase, actually. Yeah. It's very small.
It's not that big.
It's not that big, and, don't feel pressured that you're gonna have to get, high-tiered Ascended stuff to play World v World.
Yeah. It's not like other MMOs where you need, the best gear in order to do the content. You can, because everything's horizontal progression, exotic gear is going to carry you through everything until you're able to get better stuff. Even if you do exotics until you have legendary gear, that's not huge. It doesn't affect anything unless it's fractals in the whole game, which is insane compared to other MMOs.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone else have any 2 cents before we wrap everything up? Sahana, Regal?
Not that I can think of.
Yeah, I think everything covered it.
Okay. Well, yeah, hopefully everyone listening got some interesting information out of this. I know we kind of sidetracked a little bit and got talking about rotations, but that is relevant given the whole episode is about learning a build, and rotations or skill combos, I think, is what people said. They are kind of important. Knowing reactionarily what buttons to push is definitely nice, but don't feel like you need to know that right off the bat when you're entering World vs. World. honestly, just read your skills, like Regal said. Make sure that you know which buttons are which. Know, like, your Clear and your Stun Break and your heal, and then, like, generally what your other buttons do, so that things are not like, I'm gonna spam all my buttons, because that doesn't work as well in World vs. World. At least in my opinion, it doesn't. I don't know. I guess, that's up to every individual to decide that. But, yeah. So, anyways, next episode, we're going to be talking about the different styles of play in World vs. World, which is going to be very, very interesting because there's a lot to talk about when it comes to that. And that is going to affect what build you're going to play in World vs. World. So I thought it was a very good segue into the next part. If you are on YouTube and you're enjoying the content, please drop a like, share with friends, or subscribe. It's all perfectly free ways to help the podcast get known and everything like that, and spread all of this cool information that the panel's giving us into other things. But, yeah, other than that, we'll see you next time, chat.